How exactly did the NFL miss on Micah Parsons, and how much are traits going to matter for the Atlanta Falcons?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast in all of the galaxy. And if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, but I'm still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, I am joined by none other than Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And we will be talking about, we'll take a trip back to 2021 and talk a little bit about Micah Parsons and why certain teams didn't look at him in the ways that we look at him now. And then later in today's episode, we'll be talking about Will Campbell's struggles in the Super Bowl. And that will get us into a conversation a little bit about, Bill Callahan and valuing traits when it comes to offensive tackles. And, how will that influence the Falcons' future along the offensive line? But this episode is basically part of the conversation I had most recently with Jarvis this week, and sort of these tangents sort of hit the cutting room floor. And so now you're getting the full Jarvis Davis / Aaron Freeman experience here on the podcast. So without further ado, let's jump into that conversation right now. Part of me wants to take it down a Micah Parsons tangent, but I'm going to try to stay on schedule here, Jarvis. With
Parsons tangent?
They're just like talking about how Micah Parsons was perceived at the time, because I remember being a big fan of Micah Parsons. We're doing it, so thank you, Jarvis, for steering this thing off the tracks. But I remember being a big fan of Micah Parsons as an off-ball linebacker. And, when he did get like the 5 opportunities to rush the quarterback at Penn State, he was very effective at it.
Sure.
I remember going through that draft process and being like, oh, well, the Falcons are, going to be this 3-4 defense under DPs, but they already have 2 off-ball linebackers in Foye Oluokun and Deion Jones, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, the best fit for Micah Parsons is as an outside linebacker as a rookie to get him on the field.
Yeah.
Like, he's not going to be like, he can be an effective pass rusher in a role, but like, he's not going to be all that, and it's like, you just need to get him on the field to do something. And then next year when Foye Oluokun walks in free agency, then you can move him to off-ball linebacker and take Foye's spot or whatever. That was the mentality I had, because it was like, this is the thing that he did. And then when he comes to the league and the Cowboys are like thinking the same thing, they're like, oh, we're drafting this guy to be a linebacker. DeMarcus Lawrence gets hurt in like week 2, and they're like, well, we need something. Can Micah, you did a couple of things in the preseason rushing the quarterback, so you do it. And then he goes out there like in his first game and gets like 5 pressures, and it's like, okay, like that's pretty good. Let's see if you can do it again. And then and it just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. Yeah. But like the entire time with the Cowboys, like even in their head, they were still like, well, we drafted you to be a linebacker. And it wasn't until halfway through his second year where they were like, you know what? Actually, the best way to use you is the way that we've been using you this entire time. So we're not even worried about the linebacker stuff. But like, it was still kind of this like, just get him on the field and let him cook. So, credit to Dan Quinn and them for doing that.
Sure.
But even then, like, you have this thing where, and I'm certainly still guilty of this, and haven't shown the growth that Jeff Ulbrich has, of just like, you have an idea of like, this is what the player does, this is what the player is, this is what we need the player to do, and the job of the coach and the evaluator, whatever, is to kind of marry those two things in the best way, as opposed to me, what was interesting about what Jeff Ulbrich was saying was just kind of like, here's what the player does, and the coach needs to be flexible enough to adjust what he does to fit the player, as opposed to trying to bridge that gap. Because my mindset is always like, the best players are always the players where the coach does a certain thing, the player does a certain thing, and they perfectly fit together. And then that allows that player to blossom. But it's kind of like, if you have the player doing this, you as a coach got to figure out a way to get that sort of thing. And so I think that's an interesting thing, but my brain still hasn't wrapped my head around that concept either.
Yeah, man. And I think that going back to when Micah came out, I think some people forget that he was being knocked down, so to speak, because he had taken a year off for the whole COVID deal. And people were like, oh, yeah, he's not a first round pick. He might be up to dust stuff off. I was like, no, did y'all see what he was doing when he was on the field? He ain't take no licks. He ain't take no licks for a whole year. That's going to add to his career. Like, you think he was just sitting around just chilling? Like, hey, man, I'm taking the year off, you know what I'm saying? COVID, whatever. And I think the knock on him was because he had taken that year off. And I think that a lot of teams are looking back and regretting that.
So there's still more to come here on Locked On Falcons with myself and Jarvis talking about Will Campbell and his struggles in the Super Bowl. And we'll talk a little bit about arm length and traits and whatnot and how that applies potentially to the Bill Callahan-led offensive line and how my man loves him some traits. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. The Winter Games are officially here, and if you're anything like us, you're locked into every event that you only get to see on the biggest stage once every 4 years. It's the Olympics, so you know the drama and the intensity is there, and FanDuel is going to give you more ways to stay connected with the action, whether you're an expert on curling, speed skating, or hockey, or you're like me and you don't know the first thing about half of these sports, but even niche events become must-watch when you're fully locked into the competition, and FanDuel is going to help you stay locked in. Just head on over to FanDuel.com, whether you're rooting for the home country or loving that underdog story. They're going to keep the entire Olympic experience engaging from start to finish. The Winter Games are on, and there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. FanDuel, play your game. Now, the Falcons don't necessarily have the most illustrious history when it comes to hiring the right people. They find people that look good on paper, and then you find out later it's not quite the right fit. And if you're struggling to do the same thing, what you need is Indeed sponsored jobs. If you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. So stop struggling to get your job post seen on other websites. Indeed sponsored jobs is going to put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results. All you got to do is use Indeed sponsored jobs, and you can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement that it deserves right now at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. Last tidbit, Jarvis, I'm just curious because I've seen a lot of discourse around this, not talking about the Seahawks, but talking about the Patriots and Big Willie Campbell and the rough game he had on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall if we talked about him last year at all on this podcast. I don't really recall, so I don't actually know your opinion on Will Campbell or anything like that. But I'm just curious, like all the discourse about, oh, his arms were too short, and this is why that arm length conversation, because we're coming up on the combine, and arm length is always a conversation. It's going to be a conversation for Ruben Bain, who's going to be one of the dominant pass rushers in this upcoming draft, and people are going to have discourse about it. And it's like, and all the people that go, you get this back and forth where it's just like, oh, arm length doesn't matter. And then people are like, well, it can be overrated, but just watch the Super Bowl, and then you'll see this is why people talk. And the nuance with Will Campbell is not that, okay, it's the short arms, it's the fact that he has a short frame where it's like his wingspan isn't very good, and so it forces him to have to be more technically sound than someone who's a little bit longer, who can just, not to say that they can just wing it or whatever. You still got to be technically sound, because I don't know. Have you seen the pass rushers in the NFL that they will beat you if you're not on your technique? Ask Jake Matthews, right? As young Caleb McGarry, like when his technique was bad, it was rough. Yes. But like it's an interesting discourse. Like, but this is why like these things, and people are like, oh, no one cares about arm length, and it's like it matters a little bit. It's not the end all be all that some people make it out to be, but it's things like this, games like this, that kind of expose why NFL teams are so focused on these measurables from time to time, because at the highest levels, it can be a liability when you are, under a certain threshold or whatever. So I'm just curious, when you watch the struggles of Will Campbell in the Super Bowl, what were your thoughts on that? And again, I don't recall if we had conversations about him last year, but sort of when you heard all the stuff about Will Campbell last year, what were your thoughts back then too?
I think that, let me say this first. Traits matter. They matter. And just to use James Pierce Jr. as an example, coming into this season, I looked at guys who had success or got double-digit sacks in their rookie year, and I found a commonality amongst those guys. All of them were about 6'4", 6'5", about 265, 255, 265, and all of them are running like a deer, like 4'5", 4'6", and when you look at that and you look at James Pierce Jr. and you see what he did in his first year, it kind of adds up, right? If you're looking at the numbers, looking at the measurables, like, okay, I know it's going to be really hard for him to get double-digit sacks in his rookie year, but he sure got the traits to do it. So, yeah, traits matter. However, I do think that just because a player doesn't have those traits that you look for, going back to the conversation what we had about Jeff Ulbrich, that doesn't necessarily mean they can't have success in the NFL. And I think that Will Campbell's short arms got highlighted more because he was a 4th overall pick. That's how you get judged. You're going to be judged. When you struggle, they're going to go to that trait that you don't have. That's going to be the go-to. And I thought it was a fascinating conversation hearing some former offensive linemen, some guys who play in the NFL, Big Willie Anderson, Mitchell Schwartz, all those guys were, giving their 2 cents. And I think that it was some good conversation, and I think even though some of them got to the end result of that conversation a different way, most of them said that, hey, that doesn't mean that he can't have success, but it's just he's going to have to get to what success looks like for him with those short arms. So I'm of the ilk that, yeah, if you can find a guy with those traits, man, ride with him. If you like him, if you like what he looks like on tape, go with him. But don't discount guys who don't have those traits and you like what you see on tape. So that's kind of where I fall with the whole Will Campbell situation.
Yeah. I want to make it like I liked Will Campbell. I did see some of the issues, and it was like this becomes a bigger topic of conversation, like you said, because he's the 4th overall pick.
Yeah.
If we were talking about him at the 14th overall pick, you're just like, well, you just got to get the best player. He's just the best player available. So we don't have a problem. And we know that we're not getting maybe a guy that's going to check every single box when we're taking this guy 14th overall, 24th overall, or 40th overall, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But because he's the 4th overall pick, there's a certain expectation that you're going to be a certain type of player,
Hall of Famer in year 1.
Yeah,
right.
It's like, I think back to like Jake Matthews and Greg Robinson in that 2014 draft, right? Where why did Greg Robinson go 2nd overall in that draft? Because my man had all the traits in the world, being as big as he is, as well as he can move. And it's not like Jake Matthews lacked traits. It's just like he didn't have it like that guy over there.
Yeah,
where it's like if you were sculpting, if you were building an offensive tackle, what's the ideal offensive tackle I would build? It'll look someone like a Greg Robinson. A version of that is Trent Williams is a great example of what that looks like in terms of what people's vision of what that player can grow into. And I think like with Will Campbell specifically, I think he has like going back to the point where it's just like he's going to have to be really, not perfect, but really refined in this technique to be effective despite not having those elite traits. And I think he's the type of player, based off of everything I know about him, that's going to put in the work to work on those things. Like he's the type of player that's going to take this game and be like, look, I got exposed in a big moment. I'm not going to let this happen again. I don't want this conversation. I don't want to be trending on Twitter or whatever ever again for poor performance. And so I'm going to put in the work to do that. And so I think that's what makes him, worth the 4th overall pick, despite not necessarily having the traits. But it is one of those things where like you always just see this dichotomy of like, you can go too far on the traits, right? And Greg Robinson did not necessarily work out. But it's funny to me, just relating it back to the Falcons, because I think Greg Robinson did play for Bill Callahan in Cleveland at the end of his career, if I'm remembering my timeline. And I'm just like, the type of coach that Bill Callahan has been historically is he's the type of coach that's like, I'm going to bet on the Greg Robinson because I can get him there, right? I can coach him up. I can get him to the other things, rather than the Jake Matthews is much more polished. His dad was a Hall of Fame offensive lineman. So like he's been refining his techniques since he was 8 years old, and so it'll be interesting, if and when the Falcons, invest in that tackle position, what type of player do they look at? Do they look at a player that has all these traits that maybe is a rawer piece of clay, and Bill Callahan's like, don't worry, I got this? Or, you look at JC Latham in Tennessee. That's the reason why, did they take him over Joe Alt? I can't remember. They were like back-to-back picks, so I can't remember if they took him before Joe Alt, but it didn't matter. But like, that's the type of coach that Bill Callahan is. And it'll be interesting to see when we get to the combine in a couple of weeks, seeing all these different offensive tackles that have these plus traits and these 35-inch arms and 330 pounds and running 4.9 40s or whatever the case may be. And it's like, oh, that's a Callahan guy. Get ready for that guy in Atlanta or whatever, as opposed to like the super polished guy. So it'll be interesting to see what direction the Falcons go if and when they take an offensive tackle this year. So guys, that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. Appreciate you for tuning in. We'll be back with more content. We'll hopefully get a mock draft Monday next week. I know I was supposed to do it this past week, but because of all the stuff that happened over the weekend, I was like, oh yeah, the last thing I'm going to talk about is a mock draft, given the James Pierce news. But hopefully we will have a chill weekend this week, and we can get to our first mock draft Monday of the off season, looking at a mock draft and potential options for the Falcons at pick 48. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as checking out Locked On NFL to get the latest on all the things going on around the NFL. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for all the perks that come with that. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.